This is Roy Hales with the ECOreport, which you can find on the web at ecoreport.com. BC Hydro recently slammed the most likely alternative to the proposed Site C dam project in an interview with the Vancouver Sun. The Crown Corporation's senior strategic technology specialist, Alex Tu, said some proposed geothermal projects appear promising, but the cost estimates are still very uncertain and carry a lot of risk. That seems like an incredible statement from the proponents of a project that appears to be breaking a First Nations treaty, has at least 6 impending court cases, and is opposed by the Greater Vancouver Regional District Board, the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, the BC Government Employees Union, and virtually anyone in this province worth listening to. Even the head of the Joint Review Panel on Site C said there's a whole bunch of unanswered questions, some of which would be markedly advanced by waiting 3 or 4 years. There are presently no operational geothermal projects in BC, but, according to the Sun article, the estimated cost per kilowatt hour for the 9 sites would range from 6.9 to 7.1 for Pebble Creek and Meager Creek near Pemberton, to 17.6 cents for Clark Lake near Fort Nelson. Alex Tu said, even though it says 7 cents a kilowatt hour, it's still a risky proposition. This morning's interview is with Alison Thomson of the Canadian Geothermal Association, who tells me that if BC Hydro had been using current data instead of drilling estimates from the peak of the shale boom in 2012, and currency conversions from last April, when the Canadian dollar was worth a great deal more, they would have found that geothermal is likely a great deal cheaper than the Site C dam. Okay, first of all, going to the government report, going to the BC Hydro report, what do you think about the price ranges they had for geothermal in that article? Oh, wait a minute. Oh yeah, I am taping good. Okay.
So talking about the price ranges that were presented in the report, and we do have until August the 7th, there is a public consultation period that we absolutely will be taking advantage of. I think generally they try to be quite fair and use an American-style economic model. And I guess, you're kind of at the whim of the inputs. And I think we've all agreed that some of the inputs are either vastly out of date or significantly incorrect. And one example that would lead to higher prices, as shown by BC Hydro, are the fact that the drilling costs have been put in 2012 numbers, which was a peak year for the rig count, or the oil and gas rig availability, which of course drives costs up. And of course, it was put in US dollars. And of course, there's lots of drilling companies in Northeast BC, as well as in Alberta, who would do the job. We wouldn't necessarily be at the whim of the Canadian foreign exchange rate, as well as that very high 2012 cost. And so that's a big chunk of their economic model. And when that's addressed, the numbers come down more in line with what's expected around the world. And so that's what we'll be addressing, certainly in our response, that and many other things. So we think some of the costs there are representative, and others have a heavy finger on the scale, trying to imply that the prohibitive costs of drilling will keep this industry at bay. And that's just not true. I mean, the drilling rig count around the world is down considerably. Numbers that have come out just last week for the global drilling prices are down about 30%. In some local markets, and let's call, for example, Calgary a local market that would send our rigs to BC, prices are down by even as much as 40%. And being such a large factor in the overall levelized cost of power, because of course geothermal is all upfront costs, decreasing costs by 30 or 40% will significantly lower the expected cost of power.
What about currency?
Well, this is just, I really think the limitations of the model, they took an April 2015 currency rate and then a 2012 US dollar drilling rate. And being a petro economy that Canada is, the price of oil is coupled to our foreign exchange rate, is coupled to the drilling costs. And so you really can't mix and match. You can't take one number out of context and use another number out of context and expect the best result.
Overall, could you say that the prices that they've been giving for geothermal could be as much as 40% out?
We haven't done the math yet. This is just week one of the consultation period. So I know that the drilling cost, for example, could be as overinflated by 40% discount would be in order, but drilling costs are just one part. So there's also the capital cost of the power plant. So how all that math comes together, we will be presenting that in a couple of weeks on August 7th when we make our submission. I speak with confidence, though, given that, and you can see that on our website, I can provide a link to your audience. We've actually just completed federal government funded, so not a CanGEA funded, but a federal government funded capital cost economic modeling exercise. And we looked at two different types of geothermal resource, both of which BC has. This is the hot sedimentary aquifer style up in northeast BC, as well as the more volcanic type. We also looked at three different locations around BC and also two others in Canada. So we looked at prairies and the north, but we also looked at mountains as well as coastal in British Columbia. And then we also did capital modeling of 5, 10, 15, 25, and 50 megawatt plants, both with just power as well as combined heat and power. And we also did heat sales at both 50 degrees Celsius and 90 degrees Celsius. So that sounds like a lot of information I've just given, and that's because it is. It was a 6-month study, again, funded by the federal government that was actually just submitted on June 30th. So very, very current numbers that are using what I'm going to call Canadian values. So we went out and got quotes freight on board or delivered to project sites for power plants, and we also got drilling quotes. So our numbers are Canadian, they're local, they're current, they're applicable to what the developers who own these permits for geothermal sites would use, versus using a very generic US-based model that has inputs from 2012.
What about BC Hydro's claim, pardon me, I can just imagine the reaction on this one, that geothermal is high risk?
Yeah. I think looking at what's going on right now with Site C, I think it was a $400 million, maybe it was $600 million upfront sunk cost. I mean, certainly that should be considered high risk as well. That is kind of the funny reaction to it. Absolutely. Some geothermal is higher risk than other geothermal. I mean, high risk is a relative term. I think we need to push back and talk about these Northeast BC, these sedimentary basins. We're already producing copious, and by copious I mean vast amounts of geothermal energy. And the wells, the gas wells right there are producing not pure natural gas. I hope that's not what people think is happening up there. In fact, it's a wet fluid, and a great deal of hot water or hot fluid is coming up. And that we're not using about a $200,000 little turbine to make that energy into power is kind of besides the point. This isn't high risk. It's actually being produced. And Canada, quite literally, is one of the largest producers of geothermal energy in the world. We're just happen to be wasting it.
They also have 7 lawsuits that they're fighting with BC Hydro. And we have people talking about sitting down in front of the bulldozers.
Yeah, so I don't think that we have that type of risk in geothermal. In fact, I'm happy to say that one of our members has, as a full, and by full I mean 50%, a full equity partner in the project. This is on the coast, and one that's more on the mountain range. Certainly, full First Nation support and looking to involve them in an equity position as well. And so it really is kind of the antithesis or the opposite of risk when it comes to social good.
Now, one other thing they have said is that during the 1970s and 80s, they tried geothermal and it could only produce enough steam for a 20 kilowatt demonstration facility that operated for 18 months. Do you have any comment on that one?
Oh, it's absolutely true. I was at least around during the time of mind you, but old enough to know that era. And sure, I mean, with the drilling technology at the time and with the reservoir completions technology at the time, they were able to find a reservoir and they were able to produce it and make a little tiny power plant. Now, the power plant itself, I believe, may have been limited by the size that they used for the pilot project. But certainly, I'm not going to quibble over was it 20 kilowatts or was it 200 kilowatts. It certainly wasn't 200 megawatts, which is what everybody's hope would be for that that area. However, I really want to push back with that. Sure, that's one project, 240, 250, 260 degrees Celsius. I think the proponents of that project still have a very strong belief that it could and should go forward, and CanGEA supports their motivation there. But I really want to encourage everyone to stop bastardizing the word geothermal. Geothermal is kind of like the word hydrocarbon. Hydrocarbon could mean coal. It could also mean oil sands. There's different types of geothermal is what I'm getting at. And the particular type found at Meager Creek will have its own technology and its own costs. The other types of geothermal in the province will use different power plants, different drilling and geophysics techniques to find the reservoir, and certainly will have different, and I expect, lower costs.
Okay. Do you have anything you wish to add?
Well, I just really think that it's a bit alarming that the whole story isn't being said. And of course, no one has time for the whole story. I'm not even sure I know the whole story, but I do find it quite alarming for the public when the Ministry of Energy, as well as BC Hydro, tries to sum up very conveniently that no one's bidding into their standard offer program. And, and we agree, probably their prices are pretty competitive for geothermal to participate. But what they're not saying is that there's been about 100 people, under 100 permits that have been asked for or requested, and only, literally, I'm counting the fingers on my hand, have been given out, or that the timeline to bring power online in BC's SOP has really been designed for wind and solar and run-of-river projects, and it has a very short timeline, 3 years, compared to kind of the average build-out that geothermal would experience around the world. And so we may be eligible for the SOP, but it's certainly not been inclusive of geothermal. And about this time last year, we participated in BC Hydro's SOP consultation and their micro SOP, and have not heard back. We have not had the program changed, nor have we heard back from them on if that's something they would like to speak about. And so I just think the alarming part is that people have these sound bites about, well, we love geothermal, but it hasn't been bid into the system. And that's not sincerely telling the full story. And the full story doesn't take half hour to listen to. It really is, there's not enough permits, and the SOP doesn't provide a long enough lead time.
You might not want to answer this question, but do you get the impression that they basically have an agenda? It's all laid out, all decided before they start, and then they open it up for discussion?
I think my comments on geothermal are that we're for geothermal. And so while we believe that there literally are enough megawatts in the ground to compete against Site C, that's not even what the plan would be. I mean, bringing geothermal into a system or a portfolio of alternatives where it's geothermal plus expansions of hydro such as Revelstoke, obviously some more wind and solar and run-of-river, and perhaps using the Columbia River Treaty megawatts. That's what we're suggesting. And we did ask on this past Friday when we had the BC Hydro debrief of the report that they just put out, if they would take both the new numbers that they've come up with as well as the ones that the CanGEA will be running and delivering on August the 7th for the economic model. And we did ask if they would put that into their larger system model and and really compare kind of an optimized portfolio against Site C. And that request was denied. Certainly we'll ask again. I do understand their response is that that's just not part of their planning right now, because of course for them they've moved beyond the planning. I mean, Site C is going to be built according to them. I think why I want to push back on this is, while I understand you have to draw the box around some parameters, you can't have a too big of a system. I think the elephant in the room is that some of these geothermal plants, again, not all of them, but some of them, will literally save the ratepayer and the taxpayer hundreds of millions of dollars in either avoided or deferred transmission line upgrades that are going to go ahead regardless of Site C or not. And so when you have an alternative such as geothermal that's baseload, that actually just conveniently, Mother Nature put it there, I didn't, at the end of some of these kind of aging transmission lines, and that you don't give a credit for the transmission bonus that would happen by not having to build a transmission line, that's why our numbers maybe look so high. And we certainly brought that up with BC Hydro, and we all agree that it wasn't included in the in the economic analysis. I mean, certainly the costs of interconnection were put on geothermal projects for the levelized cost of energy, but any of the hundreds of millions of dollars of credit were not. And again, I've not punched through the numbers yet, but quite frankly, I think the geothermal in some cases is literally free or negative, and in fact will be returning quite a bit of money to BC Hydro to pay as a dividend back to the government. And that should be of interest to everybody. Let's just stop calling this geothermal and start calling it baseload, strategic baseload projects around the bigger system.
When you consider the amount of damage being done to our agricultural land in the Peace River, when you consider the opposition that you have from landowners and Treaty 8, and the fact they're probably breaking a treaty, to my mind, I can't see how you can not say they're breaking a treaty. It's totally irresponsible not to look at other options.
Well, and again, back to systems thinking, we have, by some counts, 20, 30%, at the higher end, about 11 times more jobs per megawatt that are created from geothermal versus a hydro megawatt. Of course, those are rural and local jobs. They're distributed around the province. The side projects that would be encouraged would be things like fish farms and greenhouses. So, food security along with your green megawatts, and no disturbance to large tracts of land and projects with full First Nation support. I just think that we do need to take a break. I didn't propose it, but I agree with the moratorium, be it 1, 2, 3, 4, how many years, just to absorb the new information, the changing information, and that's in everyone's best interest. That's certainly something that is, instead of fighting about should we have a moratorium, why don't we think about what's best for actually looking at the alternatives and to approach the situation from that perspective.
This is Roy Hales with the ECOreport, which you can find on the web at ecoreport.com. BC Hydro recently slammed the most likely alternative to the proposed Site C dam project in an interview with the Vancouver Sun. The Crown Corporation's senior strategic technology specialist, Alex Tu, said some proposed geothermal projects appear promising, but the cost estimates are still very uncertain and carry a lot of risk. That seems like an incredible statement from the proponents of a project that appears to be breaking a First Nations treaty, has at least 6 impending court cases, and is opposed by the Greater Vancouver Regional District Board, the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, the BC Government Employees Union, and virtually anyone in this province worth listening to. Even the head of the Joint Review Panel on Site C said there's a whole bunch of unanswered questions, some of which would be markedly advanced by waiting 3 or 4 years. There are presently no operational geothermal projects in BC, but, according to the Sun article, the estimated cost per kilowatt hour for the 9 sites would range from 6.9 to 7.1 for Pebble Creek and Meager Creek near Pemberton, to 17.6 cents for Clark Lake near Fort Nelson. Alex Tu said, even though it says 7 cents a kilowatt hour, it's still a risky proposition. This morning's interview is with Alison Thomson of the Canadian Geothermal Association, who tells me that if BC Hydro had been using current data instead of drilling estimates from the peak of the shale boom in 2012, and currency conversions from last April, when the Canadian dollar was worth a great deal more, they would have found that geothermal is likely a great deal cheaper than the Site C dam.